Hello and welcome to the session where we'll be describing some of the work we've done in automating advising in higher ed for students as well as for lecturers and management and executives. And if I may, I'll describe first some of the experiences in managing academic programs where in the beginning, I was quite surprised by the lack of automation in many of our academic processes. And those processes include things like registration and accreditation and various things like that. So we started writing some simple scripts just to speed up those processes. And that really helped us to traverse complex rules. And even though it might be quite difficult for a human being to pass the complex rules in higher ed, for basic things like registration and so on, it becomes pretty easy once those rules can be coded and simply passed. So all those processes we found were quite easy to automate. And we began to realize that students were extremely sensitive to these interfaces. So even though the advice that was being generated were things that we had been saying to students for many years, suddenly they were extremely sensitive to the advice that was on this interface. And this led us to, we realized that we had strayed into the field of gamification, where by changing a color or placing something in a particular spot, you actually change motivations and you can influence people to commit to certain behaviors. And so that's an accidental entry to gamification and also expert systems. And then we began using machine learning and so on. So I'm from a chemical engineering background, and I was not even aware of the fields of institutional research, and I had no engagement with education. So this was also accidental straying into various principles that had to be realigned when advising students. So coming from an engineering background where safety is treated quite rigorously, in this case, risk and safety, which are typical engineering estimations that need to be done, those had to be thought about very differently in the human arena, where motivation can be influenced by the wrong kind of message. There was specific realignments that were needed to apply what we were doing in the field of education. Another motivation for us in doing this kind of automation work is that there are many institutions today reporting great success with student advising. And at some institutions where there may be resource implications or there may be various challenges to implementing student advising in the traditional way, automation gives us the opportunity to really advise students at scale and to achieve many of the benefits that are reported for student advising. Also, we are generalizing the concept of advising. So instead of, as I mentioned earlier, instead of advising only students, it turns out that lecturers and management and executives also are in strong need of advising, especially in the directing of resources to places that need it. Then in addition to generalizing to whom we provide the advising, we have to recognize that advising can emerge in many different ways. For example, a customization of advising might even be in generating an award or recognizing particular academic behavior. And these start to lead to interventions. So the advising is not merely providing some kind of message to a person about progress and what can be done. The advice itself can be its own intervention, as we'll see a bit later. Another aspect of this is that the advising quite often involves evaluating the status of a student or a lecturer, and that can actually trigger an institution process. So there are several generalizations of advising that can be achieved when we apply it in the sense of automation. So all this work has happened over perhaps 15 years, and there has been a great deal of functionality that accumulated into what we call the AutoScholar Advisor. And part of our attempts to rationalize all the functionality was to embed it in an improvement science type of framework. And of course, in improvement science, one establishes the metrics that tell you how the institution is performing, or how the academic program, or even how the student is performing. So the cycle can be applied at many different scales. So we establish the metrics, and then we look at the values for the metrics, and then we look into the reasons for the values being what they are. And once we understand those reasons, we are able to propose interventions and implement them, and then go on to measure the outcomes based on those interventions. And then at this stage, we can reevaluate whether the interventions worked. We sometimes also reevaluate whether the metrics are suitable. And so by following this cycle, hopefully it's a virtuous cycle, and we are achieving improvements at the institution. So at this scale, or using this approach, we look at incremental scales. We commit here to a long period of time of improving and achieving better outcomes. And to put that into some context, here's an example of improvement science at the whole institution level. So in this case, we are looking at an academic institution that's taking on average between 7,000 and 8,000 students. And we find that of a cohort that entered in a particular year, only about 20% are graduating in the minimum time, and about 50% are not graduating from that program. So they are being lost either because they couldn't be retained, so the students may have dropped out early, or they've been excluded. And so you can start looking into further subcategorizing the students there, and understanding where the bottlenecks might be, and where the fail-out points are, and so on. But in the first instance, this helps us look at some of the metrics. So these are some characteristic numbers that we can adopt. Then we can drill in further. So once we know the whole institution metrics, we can start to ask, well, in which academic programs do we have high fail-out rates, and so on. And so here's an example where we've looked at one of the academic programs, and it's showing us that we have a very low proportion here. Just 10% of students are graduating in the minimum time. And furthermore, we can drill further into the academic program level to look at the individual coursework. So which courses have the lowest pass rates? And that may help us understand how students are taking more time to graduate from this program. So we can cross the various scales, from the whole institution to the individual academic program to individual coursework, and then also to individual students. So here we can see some student results and some auto-generated advice. And the system is looking at all the student records and identifying where students are performing unusually poorly. And it's generating some advice that could be rendered to such students. And more of an example of that is shown here. And we find that when advising students, that if you have some metrics in there that make the message quite specific to that student, then there's a far greater chance of having some kind of response to that. Not just a response in terms of an email, but a response in terms of the student starting to sit up and take action and change the course of behavior. So we can auto-generate such advice. The system can pass the student records, and we can supply a template script, and a message can be generated for students falling into a certain category. So students who are at risk can receive this kind of automated message, or the message can be automated So the first instance or first draft of the message can be created, and the lecturer or counselor or dean can go ahead and customize the message from there before sending it out to the students. So that, I would say, is an example of the first instance of our advising. It's perhaps an example of advising done badly. What we want to get to is, number one, a simpler form of advising, which is in a sense more immediate. So we want that when students go and log into the system, that they immediately come to understand their status. So for example, here on the student logging in, they are immediately told that they are on track to graduate with a lower second class of degree. And that's because their average is at this value. Whereas if they want to achieve a better class of degree, if they want to get to an upper second degree, then they need to improve their overall performance or their overall result, their credit weighted average. If they improve that by just, I guess this is less than 1%, in the remaining credits. So there are still 132 credits remaining in this program for the students. So if they can raise the performance by just that amount, they get a better class of degree. So number one, this gives the students a specific goal to shoot for. And the system further goes on to recommend here that the student needs to maintain particular averages in the courses that they are registered for in the current semester. So it also scans the student and figures out what they are currently registered for and recommends that they achieve a certain average. And you'll see this average is different among the different courses. And that's because this student has already completed certain assessments. So there are still some upcoming assessments, but there are some other assessments that the student has already completed. And so in the light of these results, in order for us to achieve this higher class of degree, in this specific course, we need to achieve this higher result. So the student then gets some very specific advice about their performance level required in the specific upcoming assessments in each of the courses that they're currently registered for. And then we notice here this tempting button, improve my results. So you can't improve your results just by clicking on it, but it does take you to spaces that help you figure out what to do to achieve better results. So number one, of course, we can integrate that with the student support services. So depending on the institution's implementation of the system, this will direct you to a form of support that's appropriate. So you have many, many different support structures for students. The issues can range from academic issues, not understanding concepts on courses, or it could involve the need for personal counseling. So it could be that there are other challenges going on in the student's life outside of the academic studies. It could be related to finance and things like that. So the next step would be for the student to undertake a self-evaluation and so determine what form of support that they need to engage with. So there's a simple form here, and the student works through this, and the system advises what they should be doing to go ahead and start improving their performance. And connected with this is an ongoing study that we have across multiple institutions, where we have this questionnaire which we invite students to participate in, and we correlate their responses to this with their results. So through the study, we are starting to understand the relative influences of some of the factors shown here, like the level of interest in their choice of degree, the home environment, the funding, things like that. So this is an ongoing study, and we'll be publishing the results of this as they become available. So from the various participating institutions, we keep receiving more input, and we'll be releasing results from that as we go. So continuing with this theme of advising, as we mentioned, advising itself can be a form of intervention. It also helps the students maintain an awareness of where they are currently. So this system that you've been seeing, we call it the Autoscholar Advisor System. This connects directly with the live data. So as data becomes available on the system, the Autoscholar updates the advice that it's providing to students and staff. So it's not the case that it runs in batches or anything like that. It's daily updated in terms of its internal database, and so it's able to give up to the day accurate advice. So looking at some of the other aspects of generalizing advising, I've mentioned that we can see advising as kinds of awards. So here we can see some examples of this where if the student is engaging with the learning management system effectively and consistently, then there's a diligence award. For performing well, there's a performance award. For being simply present, there's another one, and so on. So you can create these kinds of badges and use them to incentivize good academic behavior. There are also more specific aspects of advising. So we can send messages to students about just acknowledging when they are improving. So sometimes it's not about the absolute result. It's not necessarily that the mark is particularly high, but for that student, in terms of them improving from where they were, we would be able to generate a result. And sometimes we get messages from students that they were particularly looking for some kind of recognition of something that they've done. And when they don't get that, then they actually write to us, sometimes asking for that or explaining why they didn't achieve that. So that is an indicator that there is student interest in these kinds of messages. We also have a concept scaffolding method. So in concept scaffolding, we actually break down a module into its constituent topics. So if we can identify the various concepts connected to our coursework, then we can do various things with it. So number one, when teaching a new topic, if we have this concept scaffold, we can point out that for understanding the new topic, let's say it's this one, then we can point out what needs to be revised to really understand this new topic. And then we can also emphasize the importance of the topic we are starting to study in the light of what it's going to contribute towards, so that students start to see the flow of concepts and what's needed to improve the understanding of the current topic, and why it is important to engage with that and to remember that content. So sometimes the approach to studying can be quite siloed, and by taking this approach, we try to ameliorate that. Also, if we cross-connect concepts with other courses, for example, with the foundational material, then we start to create a concept scaffold, not just for a module, but for an entire academic program. And that has many other implications. We can look at optimizing the placement of topics. We can look at curriculum revision and its implications more clearly. So there are many applications to concept scaffolding. And this is also integrated into the student self-evaluation. So if a student identifies that there are academic issues at play in their performance, and if they identify a module as particularly difficult, then they can use this method to figure out which concepts need better revision for them to improve with, which teaching content they need to engage with further. And in terms of the teaching content, we also have available the Publon Press component of the Autoscholar. So in Publon Press, we can create online documents which can integrate animated simulations. We can fully render equations through LaTeX. We can also create auto assessment questions and meta questions, which we'll look at in some detail just now. And so the students can self-test and self-evaluate. There's a space where they are then able to fail as well. So an important part of learning is being able to fail well. And in this case, we want to create the space where it's possible to get new assessment material without it being credit bearing. And so formative assessment, that's an important goal for us here. And just further to Pablon Press. Pablon, it's an invented word from physics. So like we have protons and muons and so on, the Pablon is the smallest unit. And so the smallest publishable unit, that's a Pablon. And then our Pablon Press is where in the cloud you can create your Pablons and share them and so on. So this is an example of a Pablon, this random text and image, and it can be video and animated simulations and equations and so on and so on. So if you visit this this link, you can create Pablons there. So as mentioned, you can render equations and create auto questions. So let's look at one of these auto questions. So here's a question. So the text is given along with numbers and so on. The student can select an answer and then click on submit. And then immediately the system can give the student feedback on that. So it tells the student, yes, that that choice was worth a mark. And that's because if you look at the solution here, that does correspond to the answer. And this is auto-generated. So when the question is created, it's created with variables and not just in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of the text. So you can spawn multiple instances of these questions. You can spawn many, many thousands of instances of these questions, and the student can try that question multiple times. And it's not just the question that will change, but the solution as well. So the solution updates with the new instance of a question. And if you have multiple such questions, then you have a valuable formative method available. So students often come to us with the request for more questions, for more practice material. And this is a way of providing that to them along with immediate feedback. So the tendency is for assessments to be fewer and more detailed if we don't have automation. And that's because simply the amount of time taken to create assessment questions. So in the Pablon Press method, we have an editor that eases the process of creating these questions. So we try to work towards that the time taken to create a so-called meta question is similar to the time taken to design it on paper. So of course, a well-designed question, that's what we want. And we don't want the fact that you have to use an editor to be a barrier to that. So we try to make that as user-friendly and as easy as possible to create these meta questions. And then that's a valuable resource for students. And this is some indication about how well students use that. So this is an example from 2 classes that I'm teaching this semester. And I said to the students that there was an extra bonus 2% if they did at least 2 instances of the questions. And we have some students doing 50 instances of these questions. And looking quite deep into the class, there are still many students doing far in excess of what they were asked to do. And here's a message from the class rep asking for more Pablons. And it was something of a thrill to me to see a student asking for a Pablon. At least in this case, we can say that students are quite responsive to these automated questions, and it's worth putting the time in to create them. So I guess this is just showing the editor. So there are lots of templates and things. So you can click on a template and it will load up sample code here, and you can just edit that to create your Pablon. And of course, you can fork any questions. So you can download a Publon and fork it. You can create a new instance of it and derive a new questions and so on. So if you visit that link, you can create your own Publons there. So we are looking to expand the use of this and to create more teaching resources in this way. So that comes to our incorporation of a nonprofit organization, Modern Scholarship, and that's intended to be a kind of roundtable where all the institutions play a kind of equal role, and they also help guide the development of the AutoScholar. And of course, that's then also a platform where we can share our Publon Press content. It is managed access in the sense that if you do want to restrict access to your questions, you can do so, because perhaps it's an assessment that you want not to be released before an exam or something like that. So you can restrict access to your Publons. But what we are trying for is to create a resource that can be shared across institutions. So we do encourage that once the exam or whatever it is over, that Publon then be incorporated into the public space, and also then all institutions have access to content for integration into their own teaching and learning. This is also a space where we can create coursework and share that across institutions. It's also intended to be a space where others can spin out their own products, and for some of the students coming through the system to be the entrepreneurs that can take these products out into the market and increase the usage and derive income from this as well. The main intention in showing this here is that we are trying to develop more teaching and assessment content, and in ranking this, right, if you have this explosion of content, by ranking the content, we can then achieve extremely high quality materials for our teaching and learning purposes. We are also supporting the notion of students as creators. And this may come down to even credit-bearing activity, where we say to the students, now create your own questions, and I'm going to grade you on the quality of your questions or of your teaching materials. So you can create simple text explanations of things, you can create animated simulations of things, or meta questions. And so seeing students as creators, as co-creators in this, I believe is when we'll really have that content explosion. Thanks very much for listening.